Attacks on the ANC President from within the party will not be entertained. That's according to Party President Cyril Ramaphosa, who gave feedback from the party's Special Executive Committee meeting at the weekend. There's been a backlash since Ramaphosa penned a letter urging ANC members to stop and expose corruption. Ramaphosa says he has not responded to his predecessor, former President Jacob Zuma's letter that he wrote in response, rebuking Ramaphosa's letter to ANC members. ANC National Chairperson Gwede Mantashe says Zuma's letter isn't ANC culture in terms of attacking your successor.
ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa says he will not publicly entertain former President Jacob Zuma's letter. Ramaphosa says he doesn't even understand the reasoning behind the letter. However, Ramaphosa's letter to ANC members was endorsed by the ANC, its highest decision-making structure between conferences, a letter that Zuma rebuked.
And so I have not responded to the letter, and I don't even know what the reasoning for the letters were, and will not even publicly entertain issues that are raised in the letter because I think it's important as the leaders where we are that if we are to engage in discussions, we should do it within the confines of our movement as leaders.
A frank-speaking National Chairperson Gwede Mantashe says Zuma's letter smacks of a well-orchestrated campaign against Ramaphosa.
It is something that is almost a taboo for any official to attack his predecessor or his successor. It's not done because there must be a particular relationship between a successor and a predecessor. And this letter of letters actually worked against that. For example, the reason that this letter became to look suspicious is that it follows on a letter by Angelo, it follows another letter by other group and another thing. So it looks like a choreographed attack on the president. And we have a responsibility to actually kill a choreographed attack on the president.
Ramaphosa, laying down the gauntlet, says all ANC leaders charged with corruption must step aside with immediate effect.
Cadres of the ANC who are reported to be involved in corrupt and other serious criminal practices must go to the Integrity Commission to explain themselves. Those who do not give an acceptable explanation may be suspended. NEC also decided that cadres of the ANC who are convicted of corruption or other serious crimes must resign from leadership positions and face disciplinary action in line with the ANC constitution.
ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa has come out emboldened and strong after this weekend's Special National Executive Committee meeting of the ANC. The contents of Ramaphosa's letter to ANC members was endorsed by this highest decision-making structure between conferences, showing a strength and zeal to fight corruption of the president, a letter that was rebuked by his predecessor, Jacob Zuma. Sithembile Mbete, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Right, let's get some analysis on the ANC NEC meeting that concluded. I'm joined by Dr. Sithembile Mbete. She's a senior lecturer from the University of Pretoria, and Angelo Fick, a political analyst and director of research at ASRI. Thanks both so much for your time. Dr. Mbete, perhaps I'll start with you. The president of the ANC reported as saying that what's happening there shouldn't be characterized as a power contest, rather that the ANC is being repositioned and decisions are being taken around implementing those decisions of the 54th National Conference. What do you think?
Well, look, I think that the president is doing what any politician would do in answer to the question about the National Executive Committee meeting this weekend. I do think that this is part of a power context. Let's remember that we are in the midterm of the president's term as ANC president, his first term as ANC president. The next conference of the ANC is in December 2022. And as we see around the midterm of as we've seen around the midterm of previous ANC presidents, there will always be attempts to try to grab power and to reorganize the balance of power within the party in order to favor somebody else to take over from the incumbent at the next party conference. And I think that what we are seeing is part of the power play that we often see within the ANC. So I think the president's description of the issue is very optimistic, but I think that this is a battle for power of the party before the next conference in December 2022.
Angelo, the Treasurer General of the ANC almost lamenting the fact that there wasn't so much of a focus on the African National Congress's economic recovery plan. He says something along the lines of, we know that we need to deal with corruption, but I wish more people had asked about what the ANC is going to do for our economic recovery. Is that a good point?
Well, one thinks of Ian Forster, who cautions us to only connect, because quite frankly, those are not two separable issues. The economic recovery of the country is absolutely linked with corruption, because the corruption is not just that some people are unfairly beneficiaries of a system, but actually that it is hampering economic development at the very local level, and it is interfering with the service delivery processes that are there to ensure not just economic development, but actual human and social capacity development. And there, I think, while the Treasurer General may be right that we aren't focused necessarily on the specific economic recovery program that's being suggested, the far more urgent business is, of course, the issue of corruption, because of the diversion of funds and resources and the consequences that will have for any kind of economic recovery plan. Because economic recovery is not something that's going to happen in the future, it's something that has to happen right now. Mm-hmm. And if the now of economic planning is interrupted by corruption, there's no point in imagining some fantasy-filled future in which there is no corruption.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mbete, what, if anything, can we read into the fact that the top six of the ANC addressed that briefing earlier?
I think that we can read firstly that the president and those around him wanted to have some control over the communication of the NEC outcomes. And so whereas we would normally have the Secretary General, Esma Hashule, reporting on the NEC on behalf of the collective, what we had this time was the whole top six available to report, and the president actually reading out the press statement from the NEC and being available to answer questions from the media and other members also of the top six. And so I think that this really is about controlling the comms and controlling the message that comes out about the outcome of that NEC meeting. So that's the message that I read from having all of the leadership there today.
Mm-hmm. Angelo, this issue of corruption and implicated MPs being asked to step aside is one that is taking up a lot of public discourse. When I spoke to the ANC spokesperson earlier on, he said that with immediate effect, they're going to ask people to make lists of ANC members and members of parliament who've been charged with corruption in an effort to try and stop corrupt practices happening. Is the ANC doing enough in terms of optics to convince South Africans that they do have a plan and they are serious about dealing with corruption?
So the question of whether they're doing enough is answered in the statement that was released, because in that statement you will see very carefully that while various members talk about how they're going to act, the wording of the statement is such that it allows a lot of room for people to continue to maneuver. So the language of the provisional, where they say people may do this, they may face these consequences. In other moments, despite the call from ordinary South Africans that party and state need to be separated, wording around whether or not party members will be allowed to do business with the state is something that I think needs to be looked at and worked at carefully if the party wants to convince South Africans that it is serious. And the actions that are described is to protect the legal rights of ANC members and their families to proceed to live in South Africa in all sorts of ways. But that may not be what ordinary South Africans are listening out for, given the extent of the corruption and given the consequences of the corruption around everything from PPE through to food parcels being diverted. And so the party is running a very, very thin knife edge balancing act, if I can mix that metaphor, because it must maintain some kind of internal coherence, which is why I agree with Sithembile that the emergence and the statement by all 6 officials is to show unity at the upper echelons of the party, so that there cannot be this conception and perception of division that the letter from the former president of the party and president of the country implies. But at the same time, I think many South Africans are looking out for a much stronger approach than the statement seems to imply, that there is still room for maneuver to work around the kind of issues for the internal mechanisms of the party to deal with people.
Dr. Mbete, how then would the ANC do what Angelo is speaking about in terms of balancing those needs and competing interests of the party and people who are watching the party?
Look, I think that the question is not just about balancing the needs of the party and the people who are watching the party. It's balancing the needs of the party in the interest of South Africans and ordinary citizens who are the ones who, as Angelo has rightly said, bear the brunt of corrupt actions and corrupt activity. So one of the things that is a bit concerning from the way in which the statement is crafted about the measures that are going to be put in place for people accused of corruption is that the implication there is that people will then be able to be on extended leave and be paid still in their different capacities while their trials go on. And we know that corruption trials, all trials really in the South African criminal justice system, tend to take a long time to reach resolution. And so there is, and because there was no definite statement against this blurring between party and state, and that that the party is still going to have control over who gets deployed where. There is no sense that this is a measure also aimed at professionalizing the public service and professionalizing government so that it will work effectively. Rather, corruption is seen as this ill and it's terrible, but it's not being linked to what we actually want, which is an effective, responsive and competent state. And until we have those two issues being joined in the ANC's thinking about the matter, there's going to be very little that actually has a positive, tangible effect that ordinary South Africans can feel.
Let's go a little bit further afield. Angelo, the ANC spoke about issues in Mali, in Zimbabwe, and in particular in Mozambique, saying that there needs to be more cooperation between ZANU-PF as well as the African National Congress when it comes to resolving the issues that are emerging out of Zimbabwe. Again, is that statement enough? Is it strong enough?
Well, there's an underlying question, which is whether these two organizations are necessarily best placed to deal with this issue, given that many of the issues are the consequence of decisions and actions made by employees of these two organizations. And what we're sitting with here is, of course, another example of what Sithembile pointed out earlier, which is that the notions on which the ANC governs South Africa, the principles of cadre deployment, its ideological reasons for doing so 24 years ago, 25 years ago, those have shifted a little bit now that the largesse of the state is under stress. And the same is happening in our neighboring states in other countries. In the case of Mozambique, it's an issue of multi and transnational insecurity issues, realignments in the global, in the geopolitics of the world, and the ways in which influence is shifting across the global south. And here I think, the kinds of analyses that brought to bear on contemporary global politics by the African National Congress is gesturing towards what is necessary to understand a world that's changing very, very fast, both in its formal transnational formations and in its informal transnational formations, whether those are issues of banking and capitalism, or whether they're issues of terror and insurgency. And so while the ANC gestures at that, it continues to rely on the language and networks of the 20th century to deal with fast emerging and fast changing 21st century realities. And that may also be the consequence of the age of the leadership of the party, because as we've seen in Zimbabwe as well, in these former liberation movements turned governing parties, you have a problem with the age of leadership being slightly out of touch, not just in terms of intellectual development and politics, but actually also with the needs of the people. And elsewhere on the continent, we've seen that that kind of schism can lead to the kinds of insurrections internal to a state that South Africa does not want to have, can ill afford, and would not be able to manage, given that it is supposed to be one of the stable environments in the southern half of the continent.
Mm-hmm. When it comes to the issue that's just been raised around leadership, new ideas, and perhaps older leadership not being as quick off the bat with ideas, when it comes to economic recovery, the ANC says it wants to accelerate transformation, economic inclusion, particularly for black people, youth and women, as well as a faster rate of growth. Dr. Mbete, does the party still have it in them to even try and achieve that?
Well, I think that one of the things that we saw very obviously from the relief efforts around COVID-19 is how much the paradigm of the government is still focused on formal economic participation and how much it's still focused on big corporations rather than looking at small businesses and small enterprises as the main employers in the country, but also taking seriously how many people in our country work in informal employment. So whether that is the informal sector that we think about of people selling vegetables on the street, but also how many people, young people, work as freelancers. So educated people with university degrees doing professional work, but doing it outside of the boundaries of a corporation or outside the boundaries of government. And our state is clearly not equipped to deal with that kind of economic activity. So any plan that comes from the ANC about economic recovery will have to grapple with the reality of economic activity as it actually is lived and is happening in South Africa by people. And that isn't the 20th century model of a big employer and workers who are unionized and they're needing to manage the sector and find agreement or a social contract in that way. That's just not how our economy is structured. And I am concerned that we don't have, that the ANC doesn't have a perspective on the economy that will accommodate the reality of what the South African economy actually looks like and how people are employed, but also what kinds of opportunities people are looking for. And so we'll see when the announcement about that economic plan does come out. But I think that the generational difference between the leaders of the ANC, and let's remember that many of the young people in the ANC have worked in government all of their careers. And so even the young people are not people who really have lived the experience of trying to make a living that the majority of South Africans do.
Dr. Sithembile Mbete and Angelo Fick, thanks so much both for your time on SABC News this evening, getting some analysis on that ANC NEC meeting there. The coronavirus